Hey guys, today I'm going to be running a webinar on endurance training where we're going to go through a couple of strategies for essentially how you can improve your endurance performance as well as your recovery around endurance. And more importantly, I think also being able to improve your endurance without actually getting injured, which is I guess, a common fault that we see a lot of when people start undertaking, new endurance endeavors. So a couple of topics that we're going to go through. Obviously, these are very short meetings, short webinars, sorry. So we only have about 15 to 20 minutes to cover endurance, which is a difficult task, but this is what we're going to do. So we're going to cover the definition of endurance. So make sure we know what we're talking about today. And then we're going to go through heart rate zones because this is probably the low hanging fruit that you need to understand when you are trying to improve your own endurance training. And then the last one about how to actually safely progress your endurance training. So to kick me off, sorry about my slides, you can't actually see the endurance training, but understanding endurance training. Firstly, there's a few different ways that we can talk about that. Now, generally, when we talk about endurance, what we're talking about is more things around like cardiovascular endurance. So we tend to look towards things like running, cycling, swimming, some type of simple activity that we would do for a long period of time, right? Now, the other way to look at it is also muscular endurance. So our ability to do things that require, I guess, more muscular stress for long periods of time. Today, we're going to talk about this for the cardiovascular element, right? Because I would say that's safely why, if you're listening to this, that's what you're more interested in. But I think it's important to understand that like endurance in general is really about your ability to do something for a long period of time. And the more physically demanding it is on our muscles, the more it kind of encompasses different ways of looking at endurance, right? The more simple it is from a muscular point of view, the more it's just really about relying on our cardiovascular system, right? So when we think about cycling, for example, a very light cycle for a very long period of time is probably something that's going to work more of our cardiovascular system. Where if we think about, I guess maybe a cycle on a really hard resistance, that's something that's probably going to work our muscular system to a higher point, right? So running, rowing, all of these things, they tend to have a higher cardiovascular output than they do, I guess, muscular endurance output, depending on what level you're at. But these are the different ways of kind of looking at endurance, right? Now, understanding the heart rate zones is where we're going to spend a bit of time. And this is probably the most important thing for you to understand when you're talking about increasing your own endurance training, right? Now, you might have heard these before about different zones. Some people call them different colors. But essentially what this means is that every time you go to a zone, right, you're essentially increasing the intensity. So, and if we look over here, so zone 1, 55% to 65% of our max heart rate, right? What this is saying is essentially this is a really easy amount of stress on the body because it's only about half of our max heart rate. Now, to give you an idea, 220 minus your age. Now, let's say you're 20 years old because that's nice and easy maths for me. That would mean you've got a max heart rate of 200, right? So 55% of that roughly, is going to be about 110, right? So 110 beats per minute, to put it bluntly, is pretty easy to do. And you could sustain that for a really long time. Now, as we kind of move through these zones, you can kind of see here the harder it's going to be. So go from 110 beats to 120, 140, 160, 190, right? It starts to get really intense. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to simplify this in a second, but pretty much the harder it is, likely the less time we can do it for, and likely the more stress it's going to cause our body, which can be problematic in endurance training because we want to be able to do things for long periods of time, right? So if we look at these different phases, right, the simplest way to put this is we kind of have, I like to think of it as like three main phases. You have your phase that's not really doing much. That's kind of, from an endurance perspective, that might be something like a walk, a really slow walk. That's more of your like activity phase. Could be used in a warm up, can be used day to day. That's kind of your zone 1, right? Then you've got your zone 2 and 3, which is like where you want to spend 95% of your time, or probably 80% of your time from an endurance perspective. So this is like, for some people, this could be a brisk walk, but I say for most individuals, this is more like a really, really slow jog, or a medium cycle, or, a kayak really slow, just something that you're putting your body under a bit of stress, but you can still hold a conversation, right? And a good way of looking at endurance in these zones is if you can talk in full sentences, you're still in that zone 2. If you're having to puff and then break it up, do word by word, you've probably stepped out of that zone 2 and 3, right? Same goes for like nasal breathing. If you're able to still breathe through your nose, you're still probably likely in that lower zone. And if you can't, if you're having to go through your mouth or do a combination of mouth and nose breathing, you've probably entered those higher zones. There's no necessarily bad or good zone. There's just zones that are more preferable for what we're trying to achieve. Now, in general here, it's more likely that if your goal is to increase your aerobic fitness, to get better at doing things for long periods of time, you're probably going to want to spend more time in this zone 2 and 3, right? That's the general principle there. So something like an 80-20 split. The other 20% is going to be that zone 4 and zone 5, which is your max effort, which is you're doing your sprints, you're doing your interval work. That's the type of stuff that you want to probably spend more like 20% of your week in, okay? So to give you an idea, that could look like 2 runs, 2 really, really slow jogs, and then 1 really, really hard kind of interval running session. Bang, there's your kind of rough 80-20 split, okay? Generally with zone 5 type stuff, that max effort, we do it for like, we could do a session of 20 minutes or 10 minutes and a couple of efforts. It's usually very small amounts of time because, well, most people can't actually stay in that for that long period of time, right? How to not get injured is really about understanding these zones, and also how to progress is about these zones, right? So if we talk about some of this next part, which is about how to progress your endurance, a lot of the time we can have faults because we do a few different things. The first one is we don't understand the zones, and we end up doing what I call junk zones, which is you're not in this low aerobic base and you're not working hard enough to do this anaerobic, big, heavy zone 5 base. So you're kind of just sitting in the middle. And that's what a lot of people do in running, and that's where they go a bit wrong. And that's a really good way to get injured. It's a really good way to add fatigue, but not necessarily add a lot of fitness. So what I would recommend to you is focus on that nasal breathing, focus on those sentences, back it off and stay in that lighter effort, like those subpar efforts, keeping reserves in the tank for your zone 2, making sure you are really doing that zone 2, so that when you do those zone 4s and 5s, you can give your 100%. This is going to allow you to be able to add progression each week, right? Now, the next thing where people go wrong in endurance training is your muscles and cardiovascular system tend to work a lot, or tend to progress a lot faster than what your ligaments and tendons do. So as a result, because of this progression where we do progress muscles and cardiovascular system, we tend to get injuries because our tendons and ligaments haven't adapted, right? So for a lot of people, they'll start going for runs. They'll start all of a sudden going from never running to doing 3-4 runs a week. They may be able to do it cardiovascularly. They may be able to do it from a muscle point of view, but they start getting these ankle flare-ups. They start getting these knee flare-ups, these lower back flare-ups. Those are because those tendons and ligaments haven't had to work in that way before, and they're going to take time. So a rough general rule with progressing your endurance is that if you're going to add some type of load, try to aim between that 1 to 10% per week. So if you go for a 1K run, you're doing 1.1. That's a 10% increase, right? You're doing, if you're going a 10K, you're doing 11K, just really try to aim for more like that 5%. It can feel a little bit slow, but the last thing you want to do is trying to overshoot it and then get injured. You're better off kind of moving slowly through your endurance so that you can do it for a long period of time, right? Yeah, that's pretty much the very, very rough overview of endurance training, right? A couple of key points there I think is worth talking about. Endurance, we tend to think of it as cardiovascular endurance, but it can be anything. However, that's how we've spoken about it today. When you think about zones, zone 1 and 2, they're your kind of like aerobic base zones. That's where you should spend all your hour rides or your hour walks or those long distance cardio sessions. Try to avoid doing that middle zone that I was saying, and try to, when you are putting in that 100% work, try to put in 100% work. So you're sending nice, clear signals to your body. And then the last one, when you are, doing these progressions and you have been doing this consistently, understand that your body's going to take a while to catch up. So that when you are adding load, make sure you're adding as minimal load as you can to get the best result possible. Cool. And that is all for endurance training. Thanks, guys.